us get started. Welcome everyone. My name is Tatiana Polito. I am the team lead for the Evidence Learning and Data team at USAID's Private Sector Engagement Hub. And I will be discussing with our panelists today on some of the work that we have done and research we have done around private sector engagement in the development space. Before we get started, just wanted to make everybody aware that we are recording this presentation and this discussion. So hopefully everyone is okay with that. I will take silence as consensus. So let me just give that a minute. Our hope is to make this also publicly available. Great, I don't see any nays in the chat. Fantastic. So the way that we're going to conduct this is the first half we'll have just very informal conversations with our various researchers, and then we will open it up to questions. However, as you're listening in around and hearing about these different research topics, if there's a question that does come to mind that you would want to ask, please do drop it in the chat box. We will be monitoring those and we can get to those at the end of the session. Fantastic. So with that, let me get started. If you go to the next slide, Ross, and set the scene for you all. So in 2018, USAID launched the private sector engagement policy in an effort to rethink the way that we deliver U.S. development assistance and to really make a deliberate move from public sector-led to enterprise-driven development. And so this policy really outlines core principles that support the importance of PSE in the agency. So the policy mandates that USAID should engage early and often with the private sector, incentivize the value of PSE throughout planning and programming, expand the use of USAID approaches and tools that unlock the potential of the private sector, and then build and act on evidence of what works, what does not, and what doesn't in PSE. So while we know that engaging the private sector strategically and effectively can help us accelerate progress in our development and humanitarian goals, how we make it practical is what we currently in the Private Sector Engagement Hub are working on. And we are working on, if you go to the next slide, Ross, on several initiatives which we call PSE Modernize. These lines of effort are centered around three goals: elevating our talent and capacity at USAID to engage, improving the experience of our private sector partners in engaging with us, and focusing on making the most of those engagements, right? By taking an evidence-based and innovation-oriented approach to updating the agency's toolkit around private sector engagement. So these are really a set of critical initiatives designed to address the most pressing pain points and limiting factors that we're facing here at USAID in order for us to realize this vision of a scaled and mainstreamed private sector engagement approach to our programming. As you can tell, there's several here, but there's a couple that really relate to the work that we're about to speak to. As you've heard me mention, we are really focused on figuring out what works, what doesn't, and making the partnering experience with USAID, I think, much more mutually beneficial. And so the lines of effort here around data and reporting, around customer relationship management, the partnering experience, all of these, and then the community of practice, all of these really touch on the work that researchers here have been delving into. And if you go to the next slide, Ross. So with Laser Pulse, USAID partnered with Purdue University, the University of Notre Dame, and Catholic Relief Services, as well as Dahlberg in one work stream, to, in essence, create a large series of different research activities and tool developments. And the purpose of these work streams was really to advance the understanding of the core suite of factors that enable or hinder the success of private sector engagement in development and humanitarian contexts. So thereby supporting USAID's effort in trying to be much more evidence-focused and much more effective in the way that we do private sector engagement. And next. And so what we have, who we are here are a series of 5 different researchers representing 5 different activities that USAID partnered with Purdue, University of Notre Dame, CRS, and Dahlberg to get at these questions around private sector engagement in the development space and with USAID. And we'll be just informally chatting with each one to give you a sense of what this, what the particular research activity entailed. And then, like I mentioned at the end, there'll be plenty of time to ask questions about anything from methodologies to outcomes to the entire process of working with private sector or with donors and academic researchers in this space. So we have with us today Dr. Jennifer Sneznik. I'm sorry, Jennifer, I always mispronounce your last name, but she's a postdoctoral research associate in Evaluation and Learning Research Center at Purdue University. Her scholarly contributions in the fields of race and ethnic studies, activism, education, and partnerships have been published in a variety of interdisciplinary journals, including Women, Gender, and Families of Color, Professional Development and Education, and Business and Society Review. We also have with us today from Purdue University, Dr. Priyanka Brunez. She's the Director of Research Development at Purdue University's Honors College. She co-developed Laser Pulse's embedded research translation model for academic researchers and practitioners to co-create relevant research that can be utilized for practice and policymaking. And from the University of Notre Dame, we first have Dr. Paul Perrin, who is a Director of Evidence and Learning at the Pulte Institute for Global Development. And he's also an associate professor of the practice in the Coe School of Global Affairs. Prior to joining Notre Dame, Dr. Perrin also served as the Director of Monitoring, Evaluation, Accountability, and Learning at Catholic Relief Services and was a member of the senior management team for the Overseas Operations Division. We also have Jacqueline Biedronski as a Evidence and Learning Program Coordinator, the Pulte Institute for Global Development in the Coe School of Global Affairs. And Jacqueline co-developed, in addition to the work that she's done with us, she also co-developed a tool set for sustainable and natural resource management with Chemonics. And finally, from USAID, in addition to myself, we have with us Dagmawit Tessema. She is a director of in the institutional support team at USAID's Private Sector Engagement Hub. She serves in that role as an interlocutor between the private sector hub and regional bureaus to foster an institutional enabling environment to support the scaling and mainstreaming of private sector engagement, or PSE, within and across agency, as well as shaping PSE opportunities in the region. So with that, let me then first kick it off to Jennifer to talk a little bit about the perspective study. Wanting to just kick it off to you, Jennifer, informally, like, what is this study? What was the driving question that you were trying to answer through this study?
Thanks, Tatiana, and no worries about the last name. I'm used to that. So to develop a holistic understanding of partnership development and efficacy, we pursued 2 research questions. One is the traditional big W questions like why, what, who, when, where, and how does the private sector engage in partnerships within, but also beyond the development context. but then also based on the literature out there, what are best practices, tools, and approaches that could be applied to enhance partner selection and engagement in development partnerships in particular. So for that, we approached it in two ways. First, we conducted this extensive literature review, which was also systematic, and it took place across social science, innovation, and business management literature, which resulted in the development of a partnership framework. Then we wanted to validate this framework with people that do partnerships. And so we conducted more than 40 interviews with people that are engaged in partnerships to help USAID make decisions based on a theory-based partnership framework that enables private sector engagement. So it was kind of a member check to see if the literature out there is actually, resonating with the people that do partnerships. So why did we build this theory-based framework? Simply because it gave us the evidence, and then it provided the structure for all our thinking going forward in developing those best practices and tools.
Oh, interesting. And so in the literature review, if I recall correctly, you had used machine learning, correct, I think? What did you learn about using this process in a literature review setting?
Yes, we did use natural language processing or NLP techniques, but technically we had the manual and automated approaches, and both of them were like complementary. But using the machine learning here was critical because we were able to process a way larger body of literature than we could have done by just doing the manual review. So the automated content analysis, we incorporated 7 times as many articles that we were able to do manually. But the manual approach was necessary too, because it helped us make sense of that landscape that we were able to paint with the machine learning.
Oh, that's excellent. So in total, how many articles were you able to review to create the PCT?
So we created, we read about close to 2,200 in the automated content analysis. And we worked like deep dive wise manually through 350 of them. So but the total was close to 2,200 for the machine learning part.
That's fantastic. And so could you talk a little bit more then about the PCT theory and what it encompasses, what it entails?
Yes, absolutely. So PCT, that strange acronym, and Ross, are you planning to put the slides back on by any chance? You can go back for 1 minute, but you can also just leave it if it's too complicated. Perfect, thank you. So PCT stands for Partnership Capacity Theory. So partnership capacity is the ability to create a pool of skills and resources and capabilities that contribute to a cohesive effort to address interorganizational interests and create shared value in a manner appropriate for the given context. So PCT is that unified partnership framework that pays attention to purpose, context, and relationship quality of partnerships holistically to emphasize the distinct partnership elements and the way they're interconnected. Next slide, please. So in total, you can see there are 14 unique purposes, 7 context factors, and 13 relationship enablers that we were able to discern from the literature and validate with the practitioners. So why does that actually matter? Because we now know that there are more reasons for the private sector to pursue partnerships in the development context, and profit is only one of the 14 if you look into the left column. So that's why it matters. And again, it helped us and hopefully USAID to organize and streamline the thinking.
This was incredibly valuable to us, since like how you mentioned, we always just think that private sector enterprises are just driven by profit. Um, but clearly that's not the case based on the literature review. Could you also talk a little bit more about maybe some of these relationship enablers, and how they showed up, and how you were able to identify these?
Um, they all showed, like all of them showed up in the literature and in the interviews, to different extent. And I think it doesn't matter what showed up most. I think what matters for both like the interviews as well as the literature is that they all showed up, because they all matter to different extent, to different degrees at different points in time during the partnership and journey. And so relationship enablers can be split into the more structural components that are more relevant at the beginning of partnerships, but then the interactional behavioral components that matter throughout, from the beginning to the end. So there's, I mean, we can dive into one deeply, but we don't have to.
No, that's fair. That's fair. And I think what we at USAID were also particularly interested in was, now that we understand these are the different, I think, components or factors that influence, right, private sector engagement, how we would be able to use them and how we would be able to apply that in the development setting. And I know that you had done a bit of work around that as well, in terms of taking this research from research to actual application. So could you speak a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. Because the PCT framework is that granulated, nuanced lens that the development context demands. It's crucial and helpful to use, while it also pays attention and emphasizes the links between private sector actions, motivations, and development goals. So some of the tools that we were able to create were guides and frameworks that structure some of the thinking and apply these three buckets that you see here. For example, in one of our reports, that's more like a research-based guide, and it's very interactive, to improve partnership success, and illustrates throughout the report how the framework can be applied. It's interactive because it literally incorporates moments where it asks the reader to pause and reflect on, hey, have you been in a situation? What did you do, or what would you do in a situation like that? So some of the tools that we are created, next slide, please, is the Universal Partnership Journey Framework, where or the short UPJF, to provide specific action steps for different partnership phases. And you see the little circles, they are literally the framework, and you can see them throughout that partnership journey. So we also created a case study companion piece with this guide, to provide more concrete examples of partners, of how partners can apply the framework to developing and maintaining their partnership. Next slide. We also created something like a partnership dictionary to help alleviate misunderstandings by thinking and talking like the private sector, to understand what the private sector means when it uses words that we use in our general context, but somehow we refer to different things. So this kind of dictionary can help to reduce those misunderstandings, and then saves time, energy, and money. Next slide. So overall, we think that it can strengthen partnership within the development sector, but also beyond development work, because it pays attention, like it is very consistent in paying attention to why, where, and how to get closer to that perfect partnership. And if you are able to understand the criteria that partners apply when selecting a partner or a project, that just simply helps you become the next partner, right?
So true. So true. And I want to bring Priyanka now into the conversation, because from the research, Priyanka, that you did around the process analyses, it seems to complement a lot of the research that Jennifer was just speaking about around the perspective study, seemingly answering similar questions, but from a different lens. So could you talk a little bit and describe a little bit about your approach that you took in the process analysis research?
Sure. Thanks, Tatiana. So our approach was a little bit different from what Jennifer was talking in terms of the perspective study, where they were looking at a much broader scope. So for our study, our scope was specific to USAID's private sector engagement activities, really to understand how USAID engages different types of private sector, what processes are used, and what roles are played by different private sector. Like you mentioned, in 2018, when the PSE policy came out, the private sector is still back then and now still a very non-traditional partner for USAID. And we were understanding that there were a lot of ad hoc processes that were being used to engage private sector. Some missions were engaging more, some missions were engaging less. And so there was not a lot of clear understanding within and across agency on what the overall PSE processes should look like and how to really effectively engage the private sector. And so for our study, we were really trying to understand what would lead to more successful partnerships and partnering experiences from a process perspective, basically demystifying the PSE processes used in USAID. So for our approach, we used a systems thinking approach where we identified different structures, processes, and people who are involved in kind of the start to finish process of the private sector engagement, such as, I think y'all have the PSE point of contacts in USAID, mission bureaus, IOs. So we conducted very deep dive case analysis of different partnerships that y'all already have. In-depth, semi-structured interviews were conducted with kind of all of the partners. So not just USAID, but also private sector implementing partners, other partners, kind of looking at it at a 360-degree understanding and understanding the story of the partnership. How did it form? What happened? So basically, we interviewed all of these different, individuals that were involved in the engagement. Through this case-based qualitative inquiry, we were able to identify key factors that are really important and critical to design and implement such engagements effectively. So that was kind of our approach.
And that was great, I think, from a USAID perspective, because as Jennifer mentioned, we were getting the bigger picture of what did the academic literature, what did literature say, and then ground truthing that with private sector, with the private sector around like what were some of these topics that mattered when engaging with the PSC. And Priyanka, what you're describing was also super helpful because it was almost from the bottom up, looking specifically at USAID and our partnering process and where, what was that experience like? And so you'd mentioned case studies, and I'm wondering if there were some common themes that you discovered in the partnering process with USAID that you could highlight.
Yeah, right as I talk about that, I do want to mention that in June, we are having kind of a webinar to talk about this particular study. And then in July, we're planning on having some clinics around these topics. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I'll kind of talk about four main things that we found out as most critical. So what we were able to validate is that regardless of region, sector, purpose of what that engagement was for, every engagement went through the same partnership life cycle, and it comprised of kind of three main phases. You had exploration, formulation, and implementation, which also included closeout. But what we learned is that people entered through these different phases differently. So sometimes people would start directly in formulation because they thought they've already explored and had an established relationship, but that's where issues happened, is that they never went through exploration. So again, even though the phases remain same, where the ad hocness came from is that people were entering these phases in different points of the life cycle. We also learned that one of the main reasons why the initial conversations didn't pan out was because even though there was a lot of excitement in partnering with USAID, when like the nuts and bolts started coming, right? Rubber hits the ground, whatever the expression is, and started discussing the operational aspects of how to make a partnership a reality, the private sector soon realizes the amount of time, resources needed to overcome these operational differences between how they operate and how some of the requirements of USAID. And so a lot of the times, even though there was excitement, that's when things started fizzling out. The third kind of piece that was, I think, really important is USAID is still trying to learn how to truly partner with the private sector. This is still a very new thing. Like, this is a new partner for them. You know, a lot of development actors that USAID is traditionally, partnered with, like implementing partners and NGOs, they develop theories of change that are really focused on development goals, health outcomes, etc., and activities related to that. But when it comes to the private sector, there's still little bit of learning curve on how to incorporate private sector perspectives into these theories of change in terms of understanding their motivations and involvement in the theory of change. And as Jennifer mentioned, there's not just one motivation. And that's something we also found is there were lots of motivations. So how can that be incorporated into the theory of change was really important. Lastly, we found that unlike the NGO implementing partners who typically operate on donor funds, right? Private sector engagement are partnering because there's a purpose why they want to partner. And so for them, they're constantly evaluating whether it's worth their time and resources to continue this engagement with USAID, even once the partnership has been established. So even though most of USAID's reporting M&E is focused on development metrics and indicators, we found that there's a need to establish partnership monitoring processes. We found that without having these processes, it was really challenging for partners to assess their experience. And what happened is, because of that, a lot of partners start getting discouraged and disengaged from the partnerships, which were kind of some of the observations from our case studies.
Very interesting and also very relevant, as you all saw in the slide around PSE Modernize. One of the areas that we're really focused on is the partnership experience and understanding that it doesn't end with the actual official, documentation around a partnership, but then throughout implementation, as Priyanka is talking about, relationship really, really matters. And so in similar question, to Jennifer is, that in the process of applying your findings, you developed a series of tools for donor activities to adopt that could help integrate these findings into data collection and activity designs. And so wanted to just provide a little space for you to describe some of those tools, particularly very interested in the work that you did around what you had just mentioned, the relationship, like measuring the health of a relationship.
Sure. Ross, if you don't mind sharing the one slide that we have here for our folks here. So as I mentioned, in the study, we found that the private sector's partnership experience is really an important consideration in this larger conversation of how to engage private sector in international development. So based on the data that we collected, we created a framework called the Perceived Worth of Continuing Engagement, in which we identified a lot of different factors, as you can see, that these factors really influence the experience that the partner is having throughout the life cycle. So not just in the beginning where there might be excitement, we want to partner, but as things progress and you hit these roadblocks and bottlenecks in the process, how do you start managing these factors and how it impacts the experience? So as you can see, these factors included value proposition, relationship management processes with USAID, the operational alignment, the expectations, right, from both sides, capacity to contribute and perform. Again, like having these conversations around, do we have the resources and the time? The consequences of market dynamics during this partnership timeframe. Things change, economies change. how quickly the partnership is making progress, and the overall enthusiasm level they have. So based on these, we found that when most of the factors are being addressed, the partnering experience for private sector was on the positive side. And when it was on the positive side, there was a perception that, yes, we have enough worth to continue this engagement. But when these factors were not managed and, the partnership experience started leaning towards the negative, they were getting frustrated and less enthusiastic. And they were starting to question whether this was worth the time and the money. And so if this continued and you didn't manage this, the scale kind of tipped and you start seeing disengagement. So that was why this was really important.
Yeah, no, and that's definitely something that USAID were very cognizant of and working to address, like I mentioned earlier, making sure that the partnering experience is a plus for both sides. And you had also developed additional tools, right, around trying to take this learning that you did on specifically USAID's partnering process and trying to then work and identify ways of applying it so that we could streamline at least MEL into something that's a little bit more, I guess, user-friendly for the private sector coming from a development space. Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah. So again, I think the purpose of doing this research was really to assist and USAID back to what can you do with this, right? So we wanted to make sure that there was some application of this. And so from the activities that we conducted, we created 4 main tools, but for today's purpose, I kind of will talk about the 2 tools. First was the PSE design workbook. So we developed a workbook. We've created a very systematic way for USAID and other donors to really conduct dialogue with the partners they want to involve, intentionally incorporate private sector perspectives in thinking about the design of the engagement that they want. Whatever initiative, program, activities, really thinking through all the different aspects, like market dynamics. What does it mean for a private sector to be part of a USAID program when the market is changing? So those type of questions were really important. I think, thank you, UN, you've put the link in the chat. As I was about to say, you can look at this tool out there. And then second tool is once the partnership has been established, we wanted to make sure that this tool helps USAID and implementing partners and the private sector to kind of assess the partnership experience of everybody, but specifically the private sector. And this tool will really help you identify where the potential bottlenecks are happening and what the root causes are. If you start observing there's a delay happening, people are not making decisions, or there's things going on out of your control, this workbook will really help you start identifying this and it'll help you create that space to start having the dialogue of pivoting or developing interventions to really address this and manage those factors in that diagram that I just showed. So these tools are basically meant to serve as a starting point to initiate meaningful dialogue and interventions to really help make progress. And what I say in my academic language is avoid collaborative inertia, right? You don't want to get stuck in not making decisions and not making progress.
No, that's great and very, very useful. I'd be very curious when Priyanka's saying USAID, I'd be also very curious about implementing partners' reaction to a couple of these resources, since they are usually in the front lines too of engaging with the private sector. And then looking forward to later on in June and July, having much more of a deeper dive around a lot of these different products. However, now switching over, I wanted to bring Paul into now the conversation. Thank you, Priyanka. Because one of the in addition to understanding kind of what drives formulation, right? We at USAID, what drives formulation, what drives the partnering experience, we at USAID were also interested in, well, does it work? Like, what's going on? And so what's the evidence out there in terms of effectiveness or the like, right? And so your work, Paul, similar to the Perspective study, looked at existing evidence and literature to create a PSE evidence gap map. And so wanted to just discuss that and ask, what were some of those driving questions that you were trying to answer with the EGM? And then how did you approach development of an evidence gap map?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for my colleagues for their work. Really interesting. I think most fundamentally, the questions that drove the development of the evidence gap map were first, what do we know about private sector engagement in the development space? And then also, what do we still need to learn? So you could just as easily call this an evidence map as well as an evidence gap map, because it shows where there's abundance of evidence and where there's still areas in which there are opportunities to build the evidence base. And as secondary question was, how can we package all of this in a way that's interactive and useful for people such as you who are participating in this webinar, with practitioners, researchers, private sector actors, et cetera. So those were the guiding questions. And we really wanted to make this tool useful to a wide variety of actors. So our approach in unpacking this was working with USAID in a co-creative process to try to understand the different user profiles for this and what use cases they might have for tapping into the evidence base. So for instance, we felt that potentially USAID program staff or USAID implementing partners and other development practitioners might want to use some of the evidence that's available to build a program that engages the private sector in some way. Or we felt that private sector actors might seek to understand how best to engage in development processes so that they could be effective in their investments. And so this really helped us identify ways in which we could structure the evidence base in ways that would be useful for users, identifying the types of filters that they might need in order to distill the evidence into that body of evidence that's really relevant to their specific context so that they could kind of filter out the noise also.
Yeah, well, go
yeah,
ahead. Go ahead. No, I was just going to follow up on that comment that this might be a nerdy question for us, but the categorization that you use is pretty interesting. And so could you speak a little bit more about that categorization and maybe that codebook development?
Sure, and I'm going to paste a link in the chat. Oh, Chris already did that, so you can follow along. This categorization matrix, there's actually a pretty robust literature around evidence gap map. And the difference between an evidence gap map and just a document repository, like, for instance, the Development Exchange Clearinghouse that USAID maintains, is that the evidence gap map has some sort of a framework attached to it. There's a matrix. And traditionally, when you look at a lot of the evidence gap maps that have been developed out there, they use a matrix where on the rows, there are different interventions, and then the columns list different outcomes of interest. Now, because of the broad topic of private sector engagement that's cross-cutting across different development interventions and sectors, we didn't think that that was a viable approach. We couldn't list every single intervention that development actors use because that would be in the thousands. It would be too cumbersome. And so we needed to think a little bit differently about how to structure the evidence. And fortunately, we were able to tap into the USAID private sector engagement policy, Tatiana, that you referred in the introduction. And in that, there is a listing of the ways in which the private sector can be engaged in the work of development, and then a set of value propositions for both the private sector actors and development practitioners. And so that's the framework that we used as the backbone for the evidence gap map. And then we further expanded our categorization framework as we identified documents for inclusion. We needed to make sense of them and add metadata to them. And so all of the filters that you see in the evidence gap map are metadata that we added to it. And so we tried to think through what are the different ways in which people might want to filter the evidence. And so we added to that elements of geography, where the evidence was, the technical sector, the technical development sector, the type of evidence that the document espoused, the type of private sector enterprise, and then other bibliographic information. So all of that together was the categorization framework that we had.
Great. And then I also know that you worked with our humanitarian assistance colleagues, right, to expand that. So that's included in the EGM?
Correct. So there were a number, one of the processes that is entailed in developing an evidence gap map is a search strategy. And so you first have to say, okay, what do we mean by the word evidence? And that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so as part of the co-creation process, we engage in that question. What do we mean by that? And we deliberately took a broader definition of evidence than some other evidence gap maps have done, where they only focus on peer-reviewed research. And as part of that search strategy, we identified different corpuses that we would look into, different search terms that we would use. And in the first cut of that, there weren't a lot of humanitarian resources that surfaced through that process. And so we did work with the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance to expand the evidence gap map and design a search strategy specific to humanitarian assistance. And we were then able to surface another over 100 documents to expand the evidence gap map with additional humanitarian resources.
That's fantastic. And total around, what would you approximate? How many resources or documents does the evidence gap map utilize?
There are about 1,000 resources in the EGM.
That's amazing. So this is a really, really robust and rich, I guess, tool for us to utilize. Not only, I think, for us at USAID, but then even, I think, for academic, for even private sector companies to really dig in. And then question for you, since this is an evidence gap map, what were some of the gaps that you actually found as you were mining through all of these documents and all this data?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of different ways to conceptualize that question. And so there are different layers to it. And the first, given the way that the EGM is structured, there's different ways to slice and dice the gaps. The first would be in terms of geographical coverage of the corpus. So what we found was that there's a relative abundance of information in Africa and Asia, those regions, with relatively less information in regions such as Europe, Eurasia, the Middle East, and Latin America. And, my gut tells me that this may be in part due to the non-trivial limitation of language. The evidence gap map as it currently stands focuses on English language literature. And so one of the ways in which we could fill the gaps there, the geographic gaps, could be by widening the language of the EGM, the languages that are covered by it, as well as investing in more research in underserved areas. Second type of gap comes in terms of the technical sectors that are represented in development. So again, there's a relative abundance of information in health, in economic growth, and because of what we just said, a deliberate focus on expanding the humanitarian sectors as well. Whereas there's relatively little evidence in other sectors, particularly I would say in the democracy and governance areas, as well as peace building. And so this could indicate additional evidence investments in specific technical sectors. Third type of gap would be around the types of evidence that are in the EGM. There's a relative abundance of performance evaluations, quite a few of those. We have a lot of case studies in there. We have a lot of peer-reviewed publications, but we have relatively few impact evaluations in the space of private sector engagement, and also relatively few meta-analyses or systematic analyses. One major gap that we found is in the relative absence of evidence around engagement of the local private sector. So much of the corpus focuses on engagement of multinational companies rather than local companies in country. And this could also be an artifact of the language issue. But we also may be missing out on opportunities to engage locally in harmony with USAID's localization agenda. And then finally, there are gaps in terms of our actual understanding of the impact of private sector engagement. So we've started to do deep dives into certain questions that different technical sectors might have, and actually engaging with the body of evidence within the evidence gap map itself. We started only to scratch the surface with this. And so I encourage anyone on this call who has specific questions, the EGM can be a way to do deep dives. So we've done policy briefs now, and they're not so brief. I would say more policy summaries in the areas of humanitarian assistance, in democracy and human rights. And what we've found is that there's not a depth of evidence in terms of the private sector engagement ability to prevent democratic backsliding. That was one of the questions that we had. And so we can also put in the chat some of the evidence briefs that we've written based on some of the material in the EGM.
Thank you, Paul. And yeah, we were very curious here at USAID around what actually like this evidence looked like, right? Around these particular sectors or these particular questions. So this mining of like information utilizing the evidence gap map has been particularly interesting, as Paul was mentioning, around what you do and don't find, let's say in the DRG space. And so we look forward to seeing that. And if, yeah, you can drop that and share what you can, I think that would be very useful. And in general, like I said before, it's very useful for us at USAID to get that type of information of now we have this tool, this instrument, being able to go in and mine some of that information to synthesize it and summarize it. So thank you. And then switching over then to Jacqueline real quick, because we were also interested, as you've all heard before, in a couple of areas, right? So around evidence creation, around ensuring that monitoring, evaluation, and learning isn't a hindrance, I guess, to partnership creation. And then in really creating a set of tools and recommendations that can be applicable. And so the work that Jacqueline has been leading and engaged in really speaks to some of these interests, right? In establishing tools to help facilitate collaboration with the private sector and ease some of that M&E burden that the private sector might encounter if it's probably their first time engaging with a donor partner. And so Jacqueline, could you tell us a little bit more about the work that you and the team did around monitoring, evaluation, and kind of helping reduce some of those barriers around M&E the way that Priyanka had highlighted through her research?
Of course, thank you, Tatiana, and good morning to everyone. So as part of a team, we developed a tool that tries to find some common language, kind of like what some of the earlier speakers were talking about, but we're looking more at indicators. So we developed what we call the HI tool, which is short for Harmonizing Development and Business Indicators tool. And it is a specialized tool that really serves as a bridge between the development sector, for us specifically USAID, and the private sector. And its primary purpose is really to harmonize or create a match or marriage between indicators used by businesses with the standard US foreign assistance indicators, which we call SPSDs. And then later on, we did add the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. But in simpler terms, I guess the HI tool really allows development professionals and private sector companies to align their goals and objectives more effectively, but also to identify the most relevant indicators that can assist in their M&E plans moving forward. And as I mentioned, the HI tool is built on the SPSDs, which provide a common set of program categories and indicators for the use of foreign assistance funds. To represent indicators from the private sector, business objectives, we incorporated well-known environmental, social, and governance, or ESG frameworks. Some of those are GRI, SASB, and IRIS Plus, just to name a few. On the ESG framework side, just to give you all a bit of background, they have emerged over, I guess, the past few decades to measure company and portfolio performance. And they're different from, say, corporate social responsibility, which focuses on a company's like positive impact on employees, customers, and the community. Whereas ESG really delves into the role of these factors in long-term financial performance. And this term financial materiality, which is quite common within the ESG frameworks, considers the impact of intangible factors like sustainability on the business value. So we also had to recognize that not all businesses might be using such frameworks, and a lot of them do utilize SDGs kind of as a benchmark in this development or sustainability field. So we did eventually incorporate the SDGs as kind of guiding principles. And although the SDGs, as I mentioned, are not a framework, they are often used both by the private sector and by US government agencies to kind of have this benchmarking. There is a site called the SDG Compass that was created to help companies align their strategies with the SDGs. And this actually served as an illustrative example to us when we were ideating what this HI tool would look like. So then we did add these to the tool.
Yeah, no, and what's really cool is similar to what Jennifer had shared earlier about translating, right? Trying to like lower that barrier of translation between donor speak or development speak, as well as private sector speak. This tool does a really good job, I feel, in trying to match, right? USAID, USAID standard indicators, which we call the SPSD indicators, with typically used indicators found in how many ESG frameworks did you review, Jacqueline?
We had about 5 or 6, I believe. We were working on narrowing it down.
Yes.
So
and then, yeah, and then the cool thing too is then there's also this added kind of matching that happens with the UN SDG goals, so that this tool can be inclusive, right, around for those companies that don't adhere to or subscribe to one of these 5 or so ESG frameworks. So that's a really, really cool tool. What's interesting too is the methodology that you used to match indicators and SDG targets. So can you describe a little bit of how you did that, and maybe some of those benefits and limitations on utilizing that approach?
Of course. So diving into methodologies a bit, the process of creating this tool involved 2 really critical considerations. And the first was determining the initial set of indicators that we were going to harmonize. And then secondly, really systematizing the process of determining which indicators were considered a quote unquote fit or a match. So as we mentioned, the SPSD indicators were identified by USAID or US government as important foreign assistance indicators across various agencies and implementing partners. So we were good to go on that side. These indicators provided a clear set of data points, allowing us to really map business relevant indicators against them. However, on the business side, we had more of a challenge because there is no universal set of harmonized indicators for the private sector. So instead, as we've mentioned, various organizations have created indicator frameworks that businesses can adopt and use to engage and work with social and environmental impact. And then across these repositories, there's thousands and thousands of indicators, and the level of utilization varies. So rather than trying to define a universal set of harmonized indicators for all industries and all sectors, we decided to develop a methodology and tool that allows USAID staff and other private sector partners to examine pertinent illustrative indicator linkages. So our goal was to produce an algorithm using some advanced text mining processes and a set of criteria that could extract important indicators from the various ESG repositories that we shortlisted. And we considered factors such as indicator consistency across repositories, usage and adoption data whenever it was available, as well as some other relevant criteria. And after partnering here with some computer science experts at the university and exploring various text mining approaches, we determined that text similarity analysis offered the best opportunity for us to harmonize business relevant indicators from all of these frameworks to the SPSDs. And to ensure accurate results, we did analyze a substantial amount of text. And once the text similarity process was complete, we generated a list of possible indicator matches, assigning higher point values to those closely aligned matches, and those indicators with lower point values were deemed as like a less likely match. So what it did, it helped us create a short list of indicators that then we manually reviewed to confirm whether there was an actual true harmonization or true match, which is then how the team proceeded. And we did have kind of like a two reviewer approach, where after we had the text mining exercise and the short list, we had one person go through and compare both indicators and determine whether it was a match. And then we had a second independent reviewer go through them again, just to make sure that there was some reliability to our assessment. We did do correlation plots for each of the indicator sets, and the team, as I mentioned, manually examined them all. We did eventually feel that we also needed to add the SDGs, as I had mentioned. So this was part of kind of our phase 2 approach to this tool. And this was an additional layer of complexity that we added. And that one followed kind of 3 main veins in terms of how we approached it. So for a few of the frameworks, they already kind of had a match for SDGs, which was nice and easy for us to do. For others, they didn't, but the SDG Compass website, which I had mentioned earlier, they had done a good job at creating those matches at an earlier point for some of the frameworks, so we were able to leverage those. And then for another set of frameworks, we just had to do it manually. So we did have to adapt our approach for different types of frameworks and the available data on each of them. So in terms of more of the limitations, which I've kind of spoken to throughout, but there is no perfect match, right? So there is no perfect match between the SPSDs and the ESG framework indicators. So what ESG indicators are mostly trying to measure can get very specific, even to kind of like an accounting level. And as it influences how businesses and their investors see them, right? Whereas SPSD looks more closely at maybe people's livelihoods, for example. So understanding that while the motivations might be slightly different, there is still some overlap as to what we're measuring. And that is what we tried to do with the HI tool. In terms of other types of limitations, we are still trying to roll this tool out. So we want to understand what the usability and the value is of this tool to others in actual use. We have hypothesized what the use might look like. We have developed different case studies, which I can talk to a little bit more about. But we also know that there's a lot of other indicators that are coming out as years go by. New frameworks are being developed. Agencies develop their own kind of customized indicators as well. And we don't know what those are at this point. So for this tool to continue to be useful, it has to stay alive, so to speak, and we need to continue to update it.
Most definitely. And I think that that's the plan that we have, ensuring that its usability remains by being current. But then to your point really quick, because this is USAID and what we're very interested in is research application, right? What are some of those ways that USAID or companies can utilize this tool in that partnering process?
Of Of course. So in terms of usability, what we're really looking at is kind of creating a common language or a common entry field. So understanding that, again, just because the business uses a common language around profitability and sales does not mean that they're not interested in measuring sustainability indicators that we in development are interested in. We see this tool as better helping understand partner motivations, to recognizing common monitoring needs, and really identifying even engagement opportunities. So as I had mentioned, we, in an effort to further exemplify how this tool can be used, we did develop a series of use cases and case studies. Each case study really describes how a specific national or multinational company approaches ESG, emphasizing different context relevant interpretations of these terms of materiality in reporting. And then we also have the use cases, which contains other specific examples for customizing searches. So actually how to use the tool, like how can you use the search strategy that the search categories that we have in there to give you a short list of indicators, because we do have over 600 different matches within the tool. And this tool really assists companies in identifying partnerships opportunities that align with their own business objectives and priorities. And we see this as an opportunity for them, perhaps if a USAID activity manager is trying to partner, let's say with GAP. GAP does a really good job at reporting their ESG. They use the framework. So that's one of our use cases and case studies. But you can see what indicators they're already using. So you can search for specific indicators within the HI tool and see how that matches to what USAID uses to report on. So it can help to start a conversation with a particular company. It can help at a later stage of a project engagement, right, to actually develop the monitoring and evaluation plan. So there are a variety of ways that this tool can be used, and we try to exemplify those through these case studies and use cases. And those are publicly available now. We did publish them a little while back, and perhaps it's in the chat. If not, I will add it afterwards.
It is in the chat. Thank you, Jacqueline. I think Chris and Ross are on top of it in terms of sharing links as we speak. And so then, thank you, Jacqueline. Finally, turning over to Dagmawit, my colleague. You know, Jacqueline just spoke about monitoring, measuring different outcomes of PSC approaches and development work. And your work also took a look at PSC or private sector engagement outcomes, in many ways complementing the research approach used by Priyanka in the partnering process, right? So looking specifically at USAID. And so could you talk a little bit about what exactly the study did and how this study added to those efforts in understanding PSC approach results?
Yeah, thank you, Tatiana, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone who's on the call today. My name is Dagmawit, and I'm, as Tatiana mentioned, I'm her colleague at the PSC Hub. So before we talk about enduring results in more detail and kind of what we set to do, taking a step back, as Tatiana kind of set the stage for us at the beginning, you know, today private sector plays a large role in creating and shaping opportunities to improve the lives of people and communities that USAID supports, right? And USAID recognizes that, and we want to increase the collaboration that we have amongst donors, NGOs, and especially private sector in driving these sustaining positive development and humanitarian outcomes. And as Laser Plus have done is, how do we build the evidence that we have to make sure that we have effective private sector engagement? So in response to that, the Private Sector Hub has shifted and kind of committed a major cultural and also operational transformation in the way development programs are designed, they're delivered, and making sure that there is an emphasis in the collaboration that we do with the private sector through co-designing, or in some instances, co-designing, right? So to support this journey and kind of building this evidence that we're talking about, the agency launched a series of enduring results, which we called ERS, in 2016. And the idea and the objective here is what we want to examine is what drives enduring results in private sector partnerships, so public-private sector partnership, beyond the lifetime of USAID investment. So after USAID has finished funding, what are the impact that comes out of it? And to do that, we wanted to really take a closer look by identifying and analyzing the characteristics that we found in those partnerships that produce enduring results. In some cases, they didn't, and we wanted to understand what were those factors. And we did that across each phases of the partnership. So we looked at design, during implementation, and also post-partnership. So kind of speaking to the methodology and also the evaluation that you spoke about, Tatiana, we gathered stakeholder perspectives and lesson learned to help us inform a broader set of findings on why, when, and how partnerships achieved enduring results. So basically after USAID funding ends, right? So we did that through interview, desk review, through to the implementing partner, to the private sector, and also USAID. And this ERS, not just 4.0, but starting from 1.0, provides a very comprehensive and systematic analysis of long-term impact of public-private partnership. So it helps us identify what works, what doesn't work, and helping us achieve sustainable enduring results. And this 4.0 specifically looked at a mixed method approach to evaluate those outcomes. So as I mentioned, we did interviews, we did desk reviews, and then we also, particularly on this one, we took a more closer look, a more narrative approach to do case studies. So that would allow us to kind of create a story and understand the impact of a specific program. So this was a very multidimensional approach that we took to get a better understanding of the complex factors that contribute to successful PSC programs. So that is what ERS in a high level has done at the PSC Hub.
One quick question. Can you explain why it's called ERS 4.0?
Yeah, so it's actually very straightforward, enduring results study. So the title became that because we are focusing on measuring the long-term impact and sustainability of development and humanitarian assistance programs. So as we're trying to emphasize that there is this engagement we're doing with private sector, we want to know what is the impact, does it work, what are some factors that contribute to that success. So particularly enduring results, in this case, refers to the significant part of the activities or activities that stem from the partnership, right, that USAID had with the private sector, they continue, right, or maybe potentially grow in scale beyond its operational period to produce ongoing impact. So in particularly, it answers the questions such as, you know, what are the lasting outcomes of USAID's programs? Are these outcomes sustained over time? What factors contribute to sustainability of program outcomes? And then by focusing on these enduring results, we try to find a more comprehensive and understanding of the impact of USAID program beyond short-term outputs and outcomes.
Cool. And so here you're talking a lot about sustainability, which we know, like in USAID's PSC policy, one of the reasons why we're really focused as an agency and engaging with the private sector is because of the sustainability and scalability, right, of outcomes that we co-partner, co-collaborate in developing and implementing that. So how are these terms defined within the ERS study? And can you describe a little bit the framework that was developed to measure sustainability and scalability?
Yeah, so the one that we took for 4.0 is actually very unique in a sense that we looked at a more holistic approach in terms of how do we define pathways to sustainability? How do we define pathways to scalability? What does that mean, right? So across the study sample that we looked at for 4.0, we evaluated partnership to have gone through pathways of sustainability through 5 distinct characteristics, right? So the first one is, did they establish or expand market linkages? So this referenced the process of creating or extending connections and relationship between different participants in the market. So this can involve activities such as, developing infrastructure, or maybe the improved supply chain, or maybe there's fostering and collaboration to achieve sustainability. So we looked at partnerships if they did that. The second one was, did the partnership enable new product or service innovation? And in the instance that we saw, sometimes community actors and also private sector partners often lacked the support that was necessary to build perhaps new product or service or community assets that are needed to meet development objectives, right? So by providing these support upfront, partnership could then enable the activities to persist in the market even after the end of the partnership. So we looked at if that was one of the factors in terms of how we think about sustainability. The other one was, did it enable a new market or customer segment or a target participant population? There was also a characteristic that we looked at, which was there a change in practices through policies or campaigns? And the last one was, did they establish capacity or ongoing capacity building efforts? And all these pathways that we think about capture long-term behavioral or practice changes, right? And that is what we look at after the partnership has ended. So those were the pathways to sustainability, but also we examined how partnership also could have achieved scalability. And scalability in this case, we looked at it as the growth that stemmed from that activity. So did the partnership perhaps reach additional participants, or did it expand new geographic scope of activities, right? So those were some of the things that we thought about when we defined pathways to sustainability or scalability. But then what was interesting about this 4.0 study that we did is that we identified 4 partnership design characteristics, and what we call them focus areas, to explore in more depth about ERS 4.0. So we looked at the partnership duration, right? So did a partnership that was only 2 years have a different factor that contributed to enduring results to a partnership that was perhaps maybe 4 years, right? What were some of those differences? We also looked at local versus global partners. So what were some of the contribution local partners had? And then not comparing it to global, but the distinct factors of those different partnerships. We also looked at the contribution of the private sector partner. So what did the private sector bring to the table, right? What did USA bring to the table? And we also looked at the market orientation of those partnerships. So those were the things that we found within those focus area. And then we took a step back, and then across all those focus areas, we found these building blocks, is what we call them. And we noted that ownership, trust, and agility were the key factors for achieving enduring results. So regardless of the sector, so we looked across different sectors, we looked across region, their market focus, and we found these building blocks across all those activities that helped be more enduring results through the partnership journey. So ownership in this case, we looked at is the involvement and commitment of all partners, right? Your local partners, your global partners, your private sector and implementing partners in driving the partnership goals and outcomes. We also found trust, which was one of the building blocks that we consistently saw. And that was going to be very important in building strong partnership, but also fostering open communication, collaboration, and making sure that there's mutual respect among all stakeholders. And the last one that we found through this framework is agility. And agility in this case is the ability to adapt and respond to changing challenges or maybe circumstances to make sure that every of the partners' needs are met. So that is the way we thought about the framework and how we define some of these keywords about enduring results, sustainability, and also scalability.
That's great. And then just taking a look at the time, I wanted to just say we did drop the link to this report, the executive summary of the report, and some of these deeper dives into these 3 factors that Dagmawit just mentioned, if you wanted to take a look at those. But it's really exciting work, and it sets USAID up, I think, for the next iteration to really now have a framework by which we're able to further explore sustainability, scalability, and some of these facets that seem to be very important in, quote unquote, the success, right, of our enduring results. So thank you, Dagmawit, Paul, Jacqueline, Priyanka, Jennifer, for those brief explanations of the different work. Let me pass it over now to Chris, who has been helping man the chat, the chat, for maybe any questions that we had received and haven't yet answered for any one of these particular researchers. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Tatiana, and once again, thank you to all of our panelists. I'm Chris Rice with Indiana University and Laser Pulse. We did receive 2 questions in the chat. We also have quite a few that we received in registration, but we'll prioritize the 2 we received from Dr. Jessica Agnew. So Tatiana, I'll direct these to you and see if you want to further direct them to the panelists. But one, based on all the tools and the findings that we've been going over today, has everyone been able to validate their findings with the private sector, and how has that looked? How's that process looked? And then from USAID's perspective, what does success look like versus the private sector's perspective of what success looks like?
Sure, so I can tackle that second one first, and then I'll open it up to my colleagues here to speak about their validation. So as Dagmawit had just mentioned, for USAID, success looks like sustainable and scalable development outcomes. That hasn't changed. That's why we also emphasize the fact that private sector engagement is an approach, right, by which we try to, or we're engaged in achieving those development outcomes. And so a lot of the work, for example, in enduring results, study in mining evidence gap map, and a lot of like the tools that were developed that we have spoken to here all stem to, or kind of address this fact of facilitating private sector partnerships, because the hypothesis that we work under at USAID per the PSE policy is that through this approach, if we do it right, meaning we actually harness right and engage with the core business model of a company, we will be able to achieve then sustainable and scalable results, right, by tapping into that core business process, helping identify areas where not only are they incentivized to work in this space, but are also benefiting the community or a market in that area as well. And they obviously have greater incentive to remain in that space than USAID does, since we work in a very cyclical manner.
Tatiana, you've muted yourself, or
Muted
someone is
yourself.
muted.
There we go. I was going to say I had finished my point, and I was just going to pass it over to my colleagues to then talk about the validation work that they did with the private sector across these various work streams.
Thanks, Tatiana, and thanks, Jessica, for your question. I had briefly indicated that we did validate our literature, our theoretical findings with practitioners, and the majority of them, 75%, were private sector partners, from SMEs to MNCs, which was almost like a split. I think there were like slightly more MNCs than SMEs, but overall we did have a really big portion of private sector partners to validate, if that makes any sense, and pick up the language that they are using, and like aligning that and harmonizing it, to use some of my colleagues' works across, so like USAID and private sector lingo.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Really great presentations from everyone.
We do have another question we just received in the chat from Brian, who's from the Global Build Collaborative. This is a fantastic question. One area we've always struggled to overcome was with different timeframes for USAID and then private sector. So what do we all think about in terms of aligning these timeframes, both in terms of the startup, but then also the implementation? And that can be for any panelist.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe Priyanka has like a little bit more insight into that, given the case study approach. If there's anything that gleaned from that research.
Sure. I mean, I would say that the question really validates, their experience, but also what we learned across the 8 case studies is that there was these operational misalignments that occurred. Specifically, time frame was one that was important in terms of financially. So even when the exploration happens and there is excitement to get together, the procurement processes of that USAID has in terms of the due diligence process, and then actually getting to the point where all of the financial processes are aligned, it takes a lot of time. And we found that by that time, again, markets have changed, or the private sector value proposition might have changed. So there definitely is a lot of thought that needs to be put together on what that means from the timeline perspective. Same with implementation. A lot of, when it comes to local private sector, some of our cases did look at local private sector in agribusinesses, et cetera. And again, crop and seasons were really important, and sometimes that didn't match with like the monitoring and reporting timelines that USAID had. So again, maybe Tatiana, like the question might be, what can, at this point from an application perspective, are there ways that USAID can address some of this, or is this beyond, the PSC hub?
Beyond us, no, it never is, right? Yeah, so we're addressing this in a couple of ways, right? So if you recall the slide on PSC Modernize, we have an initiative around we call the Innovation Incubator, where we're trying out different methodologies, both in terms of engaging the private sector as well as our internal processes, right, to engage the private sector to help create flexibility in timelines. Some companies are much more comfortable with working with a USAID or a government timeline, others maybe not so much. And so trying to create a spectrum of options and opportunities is one area that we look at. Also, I would say our engagement around and commitment to relationship management. I think a lot of this, and Priyanka could probably speak to this too, is and as Dagmawit also mentioned, a lot of success, and meaning like continuation of implementation and partnership and collaboration with the private sector relies a lot on trust, right? And transparency with the other to ensure that we're communicating and that we're both understanding each other's priorities and commitments. And so in that way, also by focusing on and prioritizing that relationship management, we're helping to build that trust so that when there are, inherently government, time limitations on things, because we do move at a different pace in the public sector, there's still that willingness to continue with the engagement because there is trust that we at USAID understand the bottom line, we understand what's the motivating factor, and that the private sector feels comfortable in continuing that commitment, right? So it's a little bit of a two-pronged approach that we're using here, but definitely working on creating much more of a grayscale, right, of the timeline or of working with us.
If I can just put a plug in, a lot of the cases, a lot of the partners just waited and waited for partners to make decisions and move things forward. And so I think if you look at the toolkit that we have put together, part of that assessment is for partners to take that ownership of seeing, hey, there is a delay in the decision making. How do we then start making that pivot on who takes the ownership and who moves it forward. Having that space to be able to have those dialogues is really important. And so the part of the implementation timeline piece, as Tatiana mentioned, I think like being observant of those red flags and where things are slowing down is really important.
Maybe to quickly add to that, Chris, before we move on to the next question, I would say for Enduring Results study, you know, one of the things that we really wanted to do was just not say public-private partnership is good, but we wanted to kind of get a sense of like why and how do you do it and provide recommendations. So if you guys look at the report that we have that we linked there, we provided recommendation and we disaggregated that data for the private sector, for the implementing partner and USAID, right? So thinking about those pinpoints, and one of the things that we really talked about was the flexibility and timeline, making sure that there was early communication, there was co-creation, and making sure that you're engaging early with those private sectors. So there's a lot of good pointers that came out to make sure that that's building trust, as Tatiana mentioned, and kind of de-risking some of those things that can come up eventually.
Thank you all. We have time for one more question. And I think we're going to go to one that we received in the registration. So it goes a little bit more broad, but what are the incentives for the private sector to get involved in development in the first place? And then how do we engage small and medium-sized enterprises as well in that process? We heard earlier, I think you usually think about multinational corporations getting involved in this. How do we engage SMEs as part of this process? But then in general, you know, what are incentives to get private sector involved?
Can I jump in, Tatiana? I mean, part of the process analysis, you know, the one thing that across the 8 case studies that we found is there were lots of different starting points and lots of different roles that different private sector played. So all the way from SMEs to corporations, the way the private sector showed up was different. And we were able to categorize that. We called it the private sector function because it was a combination of the role and how involved they were in the process. So the role could be, hey, we're just going to provide financial support. It could be all the way that we're going to provide resources. We're going to be engaged in the decision making, and the involvement piece was throughout the life cycle. Were they only involved in I'm signing the contract and then I'm kind of done with it, or are they staying involved throughout the process? What was really important. And so when it comes to the SMEs, one of the things that was really important is a lot of the engagement with SMEs. USAID relied on implementing partners to do that because of, I think, everything that our colleagues have said, that there is the starting point and where you meet in the middle for SMEs versus USAID. Language, for example, a lot of the SMEs, if they didn't speak English, how do we bring them to the point? How do we create capacity or space for these SMEs to start having these conversations directly with USAID? So as much as USAID was this big entity, getting to them was really difficult. And the role that implementing partners played in that space was also very important, to bring them up to speed to USAID processes and expectations. So again, I think there's a lot of conversation that needs to happen around local businesses and SMEs in the way USAID can directly engage with them, and the role of implementing partners and how they can support some of that.
Thank you, Priyanka. Any other thoughts from panelists? We're right at 10:30.
I just want to remind Priyanka to talk about the upcoming webinar on the process analysis.
Yeah, thanks, Yuan. We are, as I think I mentioned earlier, we are planning on having a deep dive for these topics in June, and we're also planning clinics in July, specifically around how to design effective private sector engagements and how to then monitor and assess them, the partnership experience. And so these clinics will be hopefully a lot more detailed related to these topics.
And we look forward to that. So want to just say thank you to all of our researcher panelists who presented today, and thank you all participants for joining us. Like I said, we have this recorded and we will shortly send out this information to you all. So with that, have a good rest of your day, wherever you may be. Bye guys, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye. Bye.